Welcome everyone to this IAQM webinar and Happy New Year. I hope it's not too late to be saying that. It's great to see so many of you here at the first IAQM webinar of 2024. This webinar is on air quality and biodiversity impacts of future agricultural scenarios in the UK and how spatial modelling provides policy insights. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Elizabeth Fonseca, a PhD student in the Centre for Environmental Policy's Integrated Assessment Unit at Imperial College London, where she is conducting research into the air quality and biodiversity impacts of future UK net zero agricultural scenarios. Elizabeth is supervised by Professor Helen Apsimon, Honorary Fellow at the IQM, and Dr. Hugh Woodward, and her research is funded by DEFRA under the support of National Air Pollution Control Strategies Project. As always, there will be the chance for questions at the end of the presentation, and you can submit these using the Q&A option, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And you can do this at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on after Elizabeth's presentation. Once again, thank you so much for logging on, and thanks so much to Elizabeth for presenting today. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yes, so as you've heard, I'll be speaking with you about my research into biodiversity and air quality impacts of future agricultural scenarios in the UK and how spatial modeling can provide policy insights. As you've heard, I'm at the Integrated Assessment Unit, supervised by Professor Helen Apsimon and Dr. Hugh Woodward, and my research is funded by DEFRA under the STAPS contract. So I'm going to start by providing an overview on ammonia and reactive nitrogen and their air quality and biodiversity impacts before speaking about the effects of future land policies, and then finally discussing the modeling I'm undertaking as part of my research to investigate how the spatial allocation of future land use changes can affect outcomes. So I'm starting here with some background on ammonia and reactive nitrogen, relevant policies, and deposition modeling. On this slide, I'll provide a quick overview on nitrogen in the environment, which you are likely familiar with, but if your work is concentrated in urban settings like mine was for many years, it may be a useful reminder, as well as a means to set the stage for this talk. The Earth's nitrogen cycle has been disrupted, mostly due to manure and mineral fertilizers in agriculture, resulting in excesses of reactive nitrogen in the environment, including the formation and release of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. The main source of reactive nitrogen is ammonia emissions, which react in the atmosphere to produce particulate matter, which, as you know, results in significant health impacts like cardiovascular and respiratory disease. It can also deposit itself out of the air onto sensitive habitats, where it leads to biodiversity loss. The agricultural sector makes up 88% of all ammonia emissions in the UK, the majority of which is attributable to animal agriculture. You'll hear me speak about critical loads as an indicator of biodiversity loss. This is the rate of reactive nitrogen deposition below which significant harmful effects are not expected to occur in sensitive habitats. These sensitive habitats include grasslands, woodlands, and bogs, and are shown here on this map of the UK. More than 2/3 of these sensitive habitats are in exceedance of the reactive nitrogen critical loads. In order to tackle this, there are clean air strategy targets to reduce ammonia emissions by 16% to meet national emissions ceiling regulations, and to reduce the reactive nitrogen deposition by 17%. This slide includes some of the policies relevant to address ammonia emissions and associated air pollution and biodiversity impacts. I mentioned the clean air strategy on the last slide. Here we see the kinds of measures it recommends for tackling emissions and how they are technical in nature. So things like covering slurry and digestate stores, using low emission spreading equipment, and permitting dairy and intensive beef farms. The 25-year environment plan has more high-level targets, including restoring 75% of protected sites to favorable condition. It isn't clear how or if critical load exceedances are covered in this target, but it's likely. There are also biodiversity-related targets in the Environment Act, like the creation and restoration of wildlife-rich habitats. I've looked at what the clean air strategy targets mean in practice by modeling the reductions needed in nitrogen critical loads to bring different sensitive habitats into compliance. Here is an example looking at the sensitive habitat coniferous woodland. On the left, we have a map showing the percent reduction in nitrogen deposition needed to meet critical loads for coniferous woodland. The colored areas represent the location of coniferous woodland in the UK that are in exceedance of their nitrogen critical loads. The higher the percentage, the more nitrogen deposition reduction is needed. On the right, I've plotted the area of coniferous woodland that is below the critical loads versus the percent reduction of nitrogen deposition needed to meet the critical loads. Here we see that the clean air strategy policy to reduce ammonia deposition by 17% leaves 68% of this habitat in exceedance, and that a greater than 60% reduction in nitrogen deposition is needed before any substantial reductions in impacted sensitive habitat areas begin to be achieved. This curve varies across different nitrogen-sensitive habitats, which are shown here. The dashed black line is showing the mean. The different sensitive habitats above that line, where there are lower reductions needed, are mainly semi-natural habitats, things like grasses and heath, whereas those that require the largest reductions are mainly woodland habitats like coniferous woodland that I just showed in this example. A research question I'm asking is whether emerging land use policies, including those being developed to meet net zero, could take us further along this plotted line. First, I had to dive into the very complex picture of land use and land use policy and land use futures in the UK. So that is what I'm going to take you through now. I'm starting with this land cover map of the UK so that we keep it in mind through the rest of my talk. Specifically, that UK land is finite, and by and large, it has defined uses. So for all the future land use needs I discuss, from peatland restoration to afforestation, there will need to be changes to the land uses shown here. The question is where? Do we have options? Is there an optimal path? There's a lot going on this map showing natural land uses like forests and water bodies and developed uses like industrial and commercial uses. But what I want to highlight are these uses, which represent the land we use to produce food in the UK, which take up about 70% of all land. So let's look at some of the pressures on land use and land use policies in the UK. Before we take any other needs into consideration, we know from Climate Change Committee land use modeling that in order to meet per capita food production and accommodate for population growth, we will need 7% more land than is available in the UK by 2035. To dig in a bit further here, in a recent report, the Royal Society looked at all the land use policies and strategies being proposed and said that if we don't change what we are eating, we'll need more land equal to the size of Northern Ireland by 2035, and more land equating to twice the size of Wales by 2050. So regardless of all other land pressures I discuss, changes to the map I just showed in the previous slide will be necessary. In addition to that, policies will need to provide for food security, accommodate for climate change measures like afforestation and peatland restoration, and ensure that the food produced provides for healthy and sustainable diets. Land use policies also need to ensure that nutrient pollution from agriculture, which is affecting our air quality and biodiversity, is reduced, which I described is the basis of my research. So to look at what the future of land use and therefore farming might be in the UK, I started by looking at measures currently being proposed to tackle climate change. There are many, and getting a clear UK picture is challenging. So I looked to the UK Climate Change Committee, or CCC, who've taken a holistic view of relevant policies and strategies to develop pathways towards net zero. As part of this work, they have considered agriculture and land use because it is a key sector for action to reach net zero, due to it being both a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, so it accounts for 47% of total methane emissions, 68% of total nitrous oxide emissions, and it's also key for sequestering carbon. When we look at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, a sampling shown here, we see that, similar to reactive nitrogen, the main source is animal agriculture itself, mainly on-farm and animal feed, while contributions for from things in the supply chain like transport and processing are very small in comparison. So I've looked at the land use changes recommended by the CCC so that I can model them and their impact on ammonia emissions and their onward environmental and health impacts. I've started by looking at the actions to address agricultural emissions in their recommended balanced pathway towards meeting net zero. The measures that reduce the most emissions are those that also release land from agricultural use. This includes a 20% reduction in meat and dairy by 2030 and an additional 15% reduction in meat by 2050. This diet change measure accounts for the largest proportion of emissions reductions and also frees up the most land of all these measures through to 2050. As we know, UK land being finite, it's necessary that we release this land so that it is available for onward net zero measures like peatland restoration and afforestation and bioenergy crop growth. This plot on the right shows how land uses would change in this pathway by 2050 compared to business as usual. Comparing land use changes between these from the bottom up, we see decreases first in cropland, then permanent grassland, temporary grassland, and rough grazing there in dark blue, followed by increases in forest, settlement growth, peatland restoration. We see bioenergy crops appear as well as agroforestry. We see in hatch patterns different land types that will be in excess in the balanced pathway and available for things like rewilding and carbon sequestration, whereas business as usual, these land use types will be needed but not available. When modeling or indeed making these land use changes, it's important to know which land types are available and whether they are suitable for these net zero land needs. For example, not all rough grazing land is suitable for afforestation. It's important to note that the CCC have tied diet change to food production. And this is not necessarily the case. We could have a situation where we change production, but continue to eat the same amount of meat and dairy by increasing imports, or where we as a population change our diets, but continue producing food as we currently do, which would require an increase in imports and exports, as well as mean that there's a continuation of ammonia emissions at current scales, at least. So to see the impacts of these diet change measures, I've modeled the 20% meat and dairy reduction target for 2030 and its associated reduction in reactive nitrogen deposition on sensitive habitats. Coniferous woodland is shown here again as an example. The map on the left this time shows the percent reduction in deposition due to the 20% reduction in meat and dairy production. So the larger the percentage change, the larger the decrease in deposition. The plot on the right again shows the percentage area of habitat that is below critical loads against the percent reduction in nitrogen deposition. We see again how far that 17% clean air target would increase the land area below critical loads represented by the dark black line, and the additional impact of dietary change in red, and how a much more significant reduction in animal agriculture would be necessary to protect this sensitive habitat. In this work, I have just scaled the existing relevant emission sources down by 20%, whereas in reality, it will not be evenly distributed. And there will be changes in both emission sources and their locations, as well as the extent of sensitive habitats. For example, woodland could be created on current agricultural land and decrease emissions, but that same woodland creation will increase associated habitat area and potentially the area of that habitat that is in excess of its nitrogen critical loads. So my research is looking to model where these changes may take place and what impacts they may have on air emissions, air concentrations, and reactive nitrogen deposition. I'm also querying whether there is scope to reduce animal agriculture further than what is proposed to meet net zero in order to protect sensitive habitats further. In this National Food Strategy graphic representing research by De Ruyter et al., we see that only 15% of the agricultural land we use is to produce food crops consumed by people in the UK. while 85% of the land is used to feed animals raised for food. At the same time, the majority of calories and protein comes from that food crop grown on that 15% of land. This indicates that there is a lot of scope for efficiencies in land and nutrition provision in shifting towards producing more food crops. This disparity makes sense because we know how inefficient raising animals for food is. For example, 100 calories fed to cattle produces just 5 calories of meat. This inefficiency also applies to nitrogen losses. For example, 20 times more nitrogen is lost per unit of protein from beef than cereals. So moving away from animal foods bodes well for freeing land, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing biodiversity loss due to nitrogen deposition. But what changes are reasonable? While if nutrition is more complex than protein and calories, I've looked at wider nutritional needs as set out by the UK's Eat Well Guide. Research undertaken at Oxford University and by Public Health England modeled food group consumption, which achieves these guidelines while deviating as little as possible from the typical UK diet. This plot represents the consumption changes they found would be needed. So we can see from the nutritional point of view that there is room for reduction in meat far beyond the CCC's 35% meat reduction target. This would be alongside an increase in fruit, veg, pulses, and legumes, which we've seen would require significantly less land. Others have been looking at the impact of large reductions in meat and dairy to quantify their impact on nitrogen excesses in the environment. Notably, this is the remit of the UNECE's Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution's Task Force on Reactive Nitrogen, who have an expert panel on nitrogen in food. In 2015, this expert panel produced Nitrogen on the Table, a report on the interrelationship of food, environmental pollution, and human health in the EU, looking at a 50% decrease in all animal products, dubbed a Demetarian diet, and estimated that it would result in a 40 to 43% reduction in ammonia emissions. Then just last month, they released another special report titled Appetite for Change, which builds on their previous report and looks beyond the Demetarian diet to assess how full vegetarian and vegan diets would impact on nitrogen in the environment. I have yet to read it in full, but I'm looking forward to it. So far, policies in the UK have not taken on board the CCC recommendations to reduce meat and dairy, though there are policies that impact on future land use. As we've seen, we need reductions in meat and dairy production to free up the land that is needed for net zero measures, so this mission is concerning. This brings us to my last section, where I'll describe some of the spatial modeling I've been undertaking. I've been modeling current policy and targets around peatland restoration, afforestation, bioenergy crops, agroforestry, and hedgerow expansion. I will eventually be doing every country in the UK, but I have started with just England. I will be showing you some modeling on peatland restoration and afforestation to provide you an understanding of the scale of change that they bring. So I'll begin here with peatland restoration. In addition to reducing peatland carbon emissions, which I'm not modeling here, restoration means removing activities like grazing and crop growth, which in turn lead to a reduction in ammonia, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, which I do model. Here I'm going to show you the results of a 100% lowland and upland peat restoration scenario in England. The map on the right shows the location of the peatland to be restored in pink, yellow, and blue. To produce this and the subsequent maps I'll show you, I have used CEH 2021 land cover maps at a 20-meter resolution, and I'm using ammonia emissions maps at a 5-kilometer grid scale. So this is an overview of the modeling approach I've taken. I start by identifying the extent of upland, lowland, grassland, deep peat areas in England, or you could call them the grazing lands, identify the reduction of grazing livestock, so just cows and sheep, when grazing land is restored. I then identify the extent of lowland cropland in England that is on deep peat. And then I calculate the fertilizer reduction on both the grazing and cropland when it's restored. And then I calculate the total ammonia, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions reductions with livestock and fertilizer reductions. A note on step 2, neither poultry nor pigs are included in this analysis as grazing populations, as we do not consider them as significant grazing animals, though some of their emissions and their manures still apply to land, which isn't a part of this calculation either. So looking first at ammonia emissions, we see here on the left the associated reduction in grazing animals and fertilizer, where the largest reductions are in the proportion of sheep. In the middle, we see the associated ammonia emissions reductions, where dairy cows are the largest contributor. Together, these equate to 8% of the national emissions ceiling regulations target for ammonia emissions reductions. Now looking at greenhouse gas emissions, we see on the left that methane reductions are fairly evenly distributed across the animal sectors, but with nitrous oxide shown in the middle, we see that the levels are a bit higher with fertilizer. Together, the CO2 equivalent reductions from this England-only scenario equate to 6.8% of the CCC livestock reduction target for the UK. Going on to the next scenario I modeled, I looked at afforestation. The process is similar to peatland restoration, but planting was only modeled on improved grassland areas, so no arable-related emissions were removed, only grazing. The tree planting strategy followed the broad guidance on woodland creation by the Forestry Commission, and using a potential for woodland map produced by the RSPB, where areas of different types of land were excluded from considerations such as priority habitats and high agricultural grade land. A map of the planting intensity is shown on this map on the right. Looking first at the ammonia emissions, we see here on the left the associated reduction in grazing animals and fertilizer, where the largest reductions are in dairy cows. In the middle, we see the associated ammonia emissions reductions, where again, we see dairy cows are the largest contributors. Together, these equate to 19.9% of the national emissions ceiling regulations target for ammonia emissions reductions. I have mapped the cumulative emission reductions as well so that we can see the distribution of these reductions across England. Now looking quickly at the associated greenhouse gas emissions, together we see that the CO2 equivalent reductions from this England-only scenario equates to 15.7% of the CCC livestock reduction target for the UK. Thank you. So taken together, the ammonia emission reductions from the peatland and afforestation scenarios equate to 27.9% of the national emission ceiling regulations reduction target with a 2018 baseline. Going back to our deposition plot, while I show the deposition target here, it is related to the 16% clean air strategy emission reduction target from a 2005 baseline, which was 279 kilotons, to achieve the NECR reduction commitment. The other major CCC balanced pathway measure I have to model, and I've progressed with, but don't have here to show, is bioenergy crop production. But it's not likely to go much further in protecting these sensitive habitats, which brings us back to my earlier slides, looking at producing more food crops and less livestock as a way forward. So what I have yet to do is to calculate the reduction in non-grazing animals as a result of peatland restoration. And I will be doing that for all of the different land use scenarios. And once that's complete, I will be modeling the change in atmospheric concentration and reactive nitrogen deposition. To do this, I'm using two different atmospheric chemistry modeling tools, FRAME and EMEP for UK. I am also going to apply the same methodology to modeling future bioenergy, agroforestry, and hedgerow expansion. I just didn't have the data ready to show today. I will then go beyond existing policies and CCC recommendations to investigate how further land use changes can reduce sensitive habitats and exceedance of nitrogen critical loads. An aim of this research is that it informs how policy and incentive structures can be developed that incentivize land use changes in areas that will benefit air quality and biodiversity in addition to reaching net zero. So I want to say thank you and special thanks to my supervisors and the rest of my team, as well as collaborators at the UKCEH. Thank you all for your time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really interesting to hear about your research in this topic and land use change and how that affects nitrogen deposition and ammonia emissions. So thank you so much for that. To all of our attendees, you can please do put your questions for Elizabeth in the Q&A function on your screen. I'm going to kick straight off into those now to get us started. So our first question here is around the kinds of animals that you're talking about and the land that you're talking about. So many animals are farmed on land that would have restrictive use, such as marshland and sheep on hills and mountains. Is this taken into consideration in your research, as this land maybe couldn't be used for forestry or growing crops?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, the potential uses of land are all taken into consideration. That's something that I have found is missing from a lot of the, or all of the climate change related policies, including the CCC. They've tended to look at land use in its agglomerated state. So it's just looking at totals of grassland, totals of cropland, and totals of grazing land, and looking at as I did, sort of just scaling land use change across it. Whereas what I'm trying to do is actually look at where it would be best to make those land use changes for all sorts of different reasons, but really looking at really with the end goal of it being to reduce what it does in terms of reducing ammonia emissions and biodiversity impacts. I think there is also a lot of this sort of boggy land is where we have the peatland, and a lot of that is overgrazed, and that sort of grazing is what's causing some of the carbon emissions. That's one of the reasons why that land needs to be restored and that kind of activity minimized. There's also a lot of land that, yes, may not be able to be used for other agricultural purposes, but could be used for rewilding, could be used for carbon sequestration that goes beyond what's possible when having animals grazing that land, or farmed animals grazing that land. There are, of course, wild animals that graze land as well.
Great, thank you. And you kind of touched on it there, and more in your presentation, which is around diet change and how critical that is for reducing, for changing land use, and also then reducing ammonia emissions and nitrogen deposits. I wonder, I mean, this is slightly out of your remit, but I wonder if you have any reflections on how we can kind of achieve some of these diet changes, and what some of the success factors might be in getting to those land use changes that we need.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of fortunate that that's outside of my remit, because I think that's that's the very difficult part. I think that might be why it hasn't been explicitly tackled thus far. You can see from the Eat Well guide and work that's been done before in terms of nutrition that there has been a move towards reducing animal products from a nutritional point of view, and that hasn't really gone forward. For me, what I think is the kinds of research that I'm doing, and other researchers in this area are doing, needs to be made available to the public, so the public can understand better. The public, policymakers, everyone can understand better what the impacts are of animal agriculture on the environment, not only in terms of reaching net zero, but also in terms of our air quality, our biodiversity, et cetera. So I think it's, I think we need to get more information like this out there, not to toot my own research horn. But
That makes sense. And we've got a kind of related question here, which is about whether you or any other team have considered the beneficial impacts of a more environmentally sustainable diet, not just on the environment, but also on the health of the population. And whether that's also an important thing to consider in terms of policy changes.
Yeah, I think there've been a number of studies on that. Eat Lancet, I think, is one that is oft quoted and that looked internationally. In the UK, the National Food Strategy did go away to try and look at both nutrition and environmental impact. I showed a graphic from their report in this presentation. The study that I showed that was undertaken by at Oxford and with Public Health England was looking at that combination of both. So I have the references in the presentation, which will be shared, so people can look further into it.
Great, thank you. And in your research, have you come across any information on the types of fertilizer and whether certain types give the best yield for lowest emissions, for example?
Yeah, I have not looked at the technical measure side. So technical measures would include things like different fertilizer types. That is something that is the sort of modeling that has taken place, looking at the impacts of different technical measures. It is something that I'm looking to incorporate and working with other collaborators under the SNAPS contract to see how far technical measures can get us in terms of that. But beyond that, no, I'm using the British Fertilizer Practice Survey data on fertilizer use to form part of my modeling, but nothing beyond that.
That makes sense. And kind of a related question is if it's kind of effective in this diet change and the impacts on land use change, has there been much thought given to the different kinds of crops that we might grow if we had that diet change, and whether that would have any impact on kind of the fertilizers needed and therefore ammonia emissions and nitrogen deposition?
Yeah, again, that isn't part of my own research, but I've certainly seen that being looked at and being looked at in general in terms of being able to provide enough food. As I demonstrated, the majority of food that we're growing is for animals. So there would be a large reduction just in the amount of land by moving away from producing feed to producing food that's directly consumed. But there has been a lot of work on low-till food crops, perennial type food crops, et cetera. And then, of course, a lot of the crops that would replace the protein from the animal foods would be things like legumes, which are nitrogen fixing plants. So they require less fertilizer because they are actually fixing nitrogen in the soil.
That's really useful. Thank you. And in terms of you kind of talked about if we meet the clean air target and things like that. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on, based on current policy, what the actual anticipated annual rate of reduction in ammonia or nitrogen deposition is.
So the anticipation is that that target will be met, that 17% deposition reduction target and the 16% emissions target. The modeling was undertaken to look at what could be done by those technical measures listed. So that's what's anticipated. And as we saw, it's very far from being protective of most sensitive habitats.
Thank you. And given the fact that there is that big gap in kind of what's needed, what do you think some of the eventual incentives for change might look like, especially thinking about things like the cultural importance of certain landscapes and land uses?
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, this is an area, when I put up the slide where I said, the CC, it doesn't look like government policy so far has taken on board the CCC recommendations for these changes in food production. I think this is a huge issue. We have all of these farmers that will need support, just like support was needed for workers in the coal industry or different fossil fuel industries to move out of it. We need similar things for our farmers and farming communities. Not just that, people work, all the way down the line, people working in slaughterhouses, et cetera. We need to make sure that we're providing a support system and a just transition for everyone that is working in these areas. And the fear of that, for me, not seeing this covered in policy, is that there won't be that support and we won't get that change that we need. So we need financial incentives. We have things like the Environmental Land Management Scheme and the different schemes for incentivizing different land use changes like peatland restoration, afforestation, et cetera. But it's important that they have information like I'm hopefully going to be providing on where these changes would produce the biggest impacts. But again, adding an element of support for farmers and peoples in those communities to transition. A lot of that is financial support.
Great,
So
thank you.
money, I think, is what's needed.
Great, thank you. And I think you've kind of answered that this next question with that, but just to throw it back to you in case there's anything else you wanted to add, which is it's clear that there's not a one size fits all policy with regards to tackling the issues that you've raised today. Do you think responsibility lies heavier with what we can do on a day-to-day basis, or is it something that bigger players need to take more action against?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that people can make decisions in their everyday lives. I think we can make those decisions if we're given the information, which again, I don't think is really out there for people to make those sorts of decisions, not just in terms of the environment and climate change, but also in terms of what a healthy diet is. Getting all of that kind of information packaged together isn't really available. But yes, I do think we can make our decisions. Then hopefully there'll be an element of commerce that would follow, what we're spending our money on. But also it allows people to be active in pushing for policies that would enable this transition. I think there's a reticence for politicians or policymakers to make policies that aren't popular. So if people show support for that kind of change, then I think it's possible. It all counts.
Yeah, agreed. And in the presentation today, you talked a lot, obviously, about reducing emissions. I wonder whether there's also been some thoughts around mitigating emissions, for example, by best placement of things like tree shelter belts. Are you going to be considering that type of thing?
Right. So my modeling is at a much wider scale than that, because I am looking at the whole of the UK. There are projects that are looking at those more targeted measures, things like the Nitrogen Futures project. There are reports out there. So I would encourage people to look at that project. But in terms of my own research, no, it's looking at a much wider application.
That makes sense. Thank you. And then I've got a couple of questions just kind of about specifically the types of food grown in the UK. You mentioned, of course, that most of the food grown in the UK is for animals. Is that just farm animals mostly? Do we grow a lot of pet animal feed as well? And then what are the main crops that are grown for animals in the UK? What actual crops are they?
Ooh, good questions. So we're growing food for farmed animals, are by far the largest number of animals that food is being grown for. But because most animals are fed meat, a lot of the food that is grown is being used to feed the animals that are then fed to pet animals. So it also has that inefficiency towards pet animals. In terms of the types of crops that we're growing a lot of wheat, barley, and other cereals for animals. Those are the sort of the larger ones. We're also growing maize. Maize is also grown as a bioenergy fuel. So that not all crops that are being grown are food crops. But again, the majority are for animals. And then a lot of it is grassland. So grassland that is being actively sort of fertilized and grown for grazing or for turning into hay and silage, etc.
Great, thank you. And then thinking about kind of the meat that we get from that, do we know much about how much of our meat is exported, and kind of thinking about what kind of financial incentives will be needed to change land uses where that is a factor as well?
Yeah, so I've looked into this, both DEFRA data, AHDB data, and FAO data, to try and get a good understanding of how much is grown here and how much is exported. And I don't have percentages to give people, but there is a percentage. We do I think raise more sheep than we consume. We also import sheep and beef and dairy and such from other countries. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of us, but it's certainly a part of the market that needs to be considered. And I touched on it very briefly, but it is the next thing that I'm looking at, because I need to account for that change in production and what it would mean in terms of growing less or more food to compensate for the changes imposed by these different land changes. So the next time anyone hears me speak, I should be able to give an answer to that.
Great, thank you. And then we have one attendee here saying that they think that honest discussion with farmers is missing nationally, and that reduction in livestock is occurring more by stealth. Where do you think this national conversation is, and what kind of leadership do we need to make this change?
Gosh, yeah, I agree. I agree. I don't know about, yeah, maybe by stealth, as we say, if people are being incentivized to grow trees and that they'll be getting subsidies for growing trees, whether that's for short rotation forestry that can be used for bioenergy, or if it's woodland creation, that's either going to reduce animals being reared on that land, or those animals we're going to be moving towards more of a factory farming situation, where we are no longer grazing animals outdoors and we are putting them into more factory farming type situations, without sort of a really consolidated and concerted effort by the powers that be to make sure that all of this goes together, considering each other in a holistic way. I am very concerned about what's going to happen. Who needs to be around this table? We need the farmers. We need not just the National Farmers Union and the different relevant unions, but we need the farmers themselves, of all different sizes. The supermarkets, they control a lot about, from what I've come to understand, they control a lot of what we see on our shelves and what's produced here. And we need government on board. I was at a conference with an MP who, his first focusing on how agriculture needs to change, and he said something about, meat would only be taken out of his cold dead hands type type of quote. So what do you do? We need everybody to see what the scale of the problem is, understand the science, understand the scale of what is needed to support farmers to move towards this, addressing this, and people to support it. We need activists support it. We need the public supporting the policy. We need scientists. we need everybody.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think a really good point to end on there. I'm afraid we don't have any time for any more questions, but thank you to all of our attendees for putting those in, and to you, Elizabeth, for answering and presenting today. I'm sorry if I didn't make it to your question. So that is it from us today. Thank you so much for logging in, everyone. And I hope you found that really useful.